get a question or two in, we just ask you to identify yourself, and if you have a question directed to one of the individuals, please direct it accordingly. If it's open to the group, that is fine as well. We have one mic at the table, and I'll do my best to moderate. Do we have questions?
Just for the few of us that came late, can someone just give us a brief synopsis of the what happened?
Richard or Mr. Turnball?
The three or four top points. I think I caught the tail end of your presentation, Mr.
And
Chair.
there is a press release, by the way, in the back if you missed that. That's right.
Yeah. So the four themes that we discussed were governance.
Mr. Turnbull, if you can go. Yep. It should be working. I'm just not sure it was picking up everything.
The four themes were governance, prosperity, the environment, and finance. And we looked at the broader issues at the outset of this and realized quickly on that we neither had the budget nor the time to explore all of the complicated issues. So we made some tough decisions as to what would be most relevant. And so that we used those four themes to frame our discussion over the course of the study.
Good. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Question right there?
This is Sam from the Financial Post. I just wanted to ask you to provide some color on the financial structures and options that you mentioned in one of your recommendations. You could sort of elaborate on how that could be put in place. Is there going to be some kind of a fund, or how that, what is in place already, and what more needs than that?
Is this microphone working?
Yeah, okay.
Does that work? I would say that we heard over and over again that most First Nations communities don't have access to adequate funding in order to be participants in development projects. And so we would like to, as another stage of this process, to have a very full discussion on what tools are available, what are currently available, and it's even more fundamental than what sort of financing tools would be acceptable to capital markets, for instance, or to financial institutions, or to pension plans. There's no shortage of capital available in this country to develop resources. What there is a shortage of ways of First Nations participating in the development of those projects. And so it starts with education, it starts with understanding what's currently available, it starts with something as fundamental as, if you have a project, or if you have a development that you want to pursue, how do you do it in such a way that First Nations leaders can come to the table and negotiate with full knowledge of what's available to them. So we think it starts with education, it starts with looking at what other tools could be developed, what other pools of capital could be used to access, but more importantly, how can you machine projects that are currently out there and First Nations equity and First Nations participation, all the way from equity to some other form of participation, in a way that is acceptable to providers of capital. Anyone else want to add on that?
Questions? Sorry, that.
The only thing I would personally add to that is that in the report,
Oh,
Sorry, my name is.
in the report we outline a whole lot of different ideas in terms of structures that could be worked from a capital point of view, but that's outside the notion of revenue sharing. This is about the financial aspect we'd like to hear and emphasize as you talk about is specifically about those investment conditions for First Nations.
Other questions? Right there?
Just a general question. I'm Corinne Boyd from Hatch, and I was just wondering, what are the next, what are sort of the next steps that you envision moving forward now that you've released your report? And I guess to add on to that, how can individuals that are interested become more informed and get involved?
My name, as I was introduced, my name is Richard Neyersoo, and I think the first issue for us was first to ensure that the leadership, both the Assembly First Nations and the Government of Canada, received the report, and that there were a number of recommendations that were made to facilitate processes, for instance, a national roundtable. That would be immediate because we can't move forward without that conversation taking place. Secondly, one of the conversations we had was the idea of developing an implementation strategy so that we had an indicator as to what needed to be done, how we presented the report to the communities, to the First Nation leadership, to the provinces, to the territories, and to communities generally across this country. Because a big part of the implementation of the recommendations that we're proposing requires Canadians, First Nation citizens and Canadians, to understand, number one, what's in the report, and two, how we can facilitate a more holistic approach to resource development in this country, and how First Nations can participate throughout a project as opposed to just having a conversation on engagement or consultation at the lower end of a project. The other aspects that would take much more significant conversation is the one that was just talked about financing. Because in this country, there's a lot of First Nations that have significant capital and financial resources, whether or not it's from land claim agreements or treaties, or for that matter, significant business development arrangements and profits from those businesses. The question is, can we get First Nations themselves to come together on some kind of a trust, a pension arrangement, or a capital fund that could assist in investment? Now, that conversation needs to happen nationally, and it can only happen if the First Nation leadership and those institutions are part of that exercise. So I think first thing is get the report out, to understand what is in the report, communicate what's in the report, and three, make sure that we have an implementation strategy that makes sense both in terms of how we engage the provinces, the Government of Canada, have the citizens of Canada understand what we're trying to accomplish, and see that the value of the report and its recommendations improve the economic conditions and the social conditions and the community conditions of our First Nation citizens. And that is a significant task, but it's one that needs to be done. We can't ignore it. The other aspect that is important in the conversation is that the fundamental foundation of the conversation needs to begin with the idea that treaties exist and we have to respect that. And that we have to change the conversation, that we're not Aboriginal communities. We're talking about this in the context of Aboriginal governments being orders of governments in terms of the relationship they have with the provinces and the Government of Canada. Once that foundation is established, I think we've got lots of good things to do for our people and for our communities and for Canada for that matter. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Frank Giorno. I'm with MiningLifeOnline.net out of Timmins, Ontario. Does your report address the duality in Canada right now about resource development and sharing that exists, let's say, between the First Nations in British Columbia, where treaties have never been signed, and Ontario, Quebec, and some of the eastern provinces where treaties have signed? My understanding is that in British Columbia, they have greater access to resource funds because treaties were not signed. In Ontario, they're more limited because treaties were signed and some disagreement over whether rights were devolved to the province or not, but the province thinks it has access to the resources in the ground. Whereas in British Columbia, resources were never given away.
just, if I might.
Yeah.
I can see the conversation that we've had around revenue sharing wasn't about whether or not you had a historic treaty, a numbered treaty, a modern treaty, or no treaty. It was about the idea, the principle that resource revenue sharing was a matter that needed to be discussed nationally by all First Nations and would benefit all First Nations. That conversation needed to happen in the context of whether or not the transfer happened in 1930s to the provinces of resources, or the conversation that happened recently between the Yukon Territory and the Northwest Territories on devolution. And those conversations didn't need to be guided by the transfer, the 1930 transfer, but rather in agreement between Canada and the territories with the recognition and acceptance from the province. So in principle, we don't have to get into that conversation if we can elevate the conversation in terms of revenue sharing, no matter what circumstances the First Nations were in.
Thank you very much for the questions. I really appreciate the elders' opening comments and prayer. I think after, very quickly, overarching some of your questions, it has come to a point in time, for example, that UNDRIP, as an aspirational document in this country, has to be recognized, and we have to move forward on UNDRIP. We have to move forward on the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, and there is outstanding issues there. And I touched on consultation, accommodation, compensation. For example, 10 years later, as a result of Supreme Court decisions, we're still, to a large degree, stuck at consultation. So we now have to start moving forward on some of these issues, including Aboriginal title and treaty rights. And I think the themes that we've covered are very supportive of all facets of the discussions relative to natural resources. And I'm very confident and very thankful for the document. And it is a way forward, hopefully, for the future of all of us in this country. And I hope that they added to some of this discussion on that. The outstanding issues need to be dealt with, and I hope that we can move forward on this. Thank you.
We'll go now to Vidula. I just wanted to say, UNDRIP, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I know that's, most people know what that means, but just to be clear. Sorry about that.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump back to the previous question, I think it was from Hatch. First of all, it's on a web page, so I would encourage the media to publicize our web page because we're interested in comments coming back, so we want to encourage that. This is step one. We're not the final step. The second part I would hope to encourage is that all major financial corporations, such as our banks, such as our major mining companies, oil and gas companies, this becomes a CEO issue, and they take leadership. It's not just about government. The private sector has a huge responsibility in this, and they also, in many other social issues, also take leadership. So I would encourage those CEOs to take leadership on this issue. It's critical for Canada.
So when you consulted the other Aboriginal groups and First Nations, what was their sort of key issues regarding pipelines, oil pipelines especially? I mean, is it an issue of revenue sharing, or is the primary issue the environmental aspects of it? Because there seems to be muddy between the environmental groups issues, which is greenhouse gas emissions, and the Aboriginal groups issues, which could be revenue sharing and treaty rights. What was your impression?